We think we know history. We memorize dates, faces, and slogans that sound heroic, but what if the real story was quietly deleted? Because hidden beneath the polished timelines we learned in school are events so shocking, so well documented, that they were deliberately erased from public memory. Today, we're uncovering 10 verified conspiracies and government secrets, real operations cover-ups and manipulations buried for decades in classified archives. These aren't internet rumors or half-baked theories. They're backed by congressional hearings, declassified documents, and eyewitness testimony. And the scariest part, some of these plots succeeded, others almost did. From a coup attempt by Wall Street's richest men to CIA mind control programs that sound like sci-fi. This is the dark side of history that textbooks forgot. And as we go deeper, you'll start to notice a disturbing pattern. When the truth threatens power, the truth disappears. So buckle up. What you're about to hear isn't fiction. It's just the part of history you were never meant to know. Wall Street's failed coup, 1933. You've probably heard of the Great Depression, but did you know that at one point, some of America's richest men tried to overthrow the government? It sounds like something from a dystopian novel, but this was a real, verified conspiracy, uncovered and exposed by a US general who refused to sell out his country. In 1933, while millions of Americans stood in breadlines, a coalition of industrial titans, bankers, chemical companies, tire magnates, and arms manufacturers hatched a plan to end democracy itself. Their goal: to overthrow President Franklin D. Roosevelt, dismantle the New Deal, and replace it with a corporate-run regime modeled after fascist Italy. The blueprint was simple: use money and manipulation to mobilize 500,000 disgruntled veterans, march on Washington, and install a puppet dictator sympathetic to big business. Their chosen leader was a national hero, Major General Smedley Butler, the most decorated Marine in US history. They assumed patriotism could be bought, but they were wrong. Butler listened, pretended to go along, and then exposed the entire plot to Congress. In 1934, he testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee, presenting letters, bank records, and even taped conversations with the conspirators' messenger. The committee confirmed the evidence. Its report literally stated there was an attempt to establish a fascist organization in the United States. And yet, nothing happened. No arrests, no trials. Newspapers, many owned by the same wealthy backers, buried the story on back pages. The full report was classified and suppressed for decades. When the files were finally released in the 1970s, historians realized how close the country had come to a silent coup. By then, the plotters were either dead or untouchable. Modern historians call it the business plot, but few Americans have ever heard the term. And here's the chilling part. Economists today often cite this as one of the earliest examples of corporate capture, where money quietly manipulates policy without firing a shot. So maybe the coup never happened, or maybe, as some say, it just evolved into something quieter and harder to see. And if you think that is disturbing, wait until you hear about the time America's own military proposed staging terrorist attacks on US soil to start a war. The Pentagon's terror plot, 1962. You'd think the government's top generals would be the ultimate defenders of the nation, not the ones plotting to terrorize it. But in 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officers in the United States, proposed something straight out of a political thriller, a plan to stage fake terrorist attacks on American citizens, and blame Cuba. It was called Operation Northwoods. Recently declassified documents revealed just how far they were willing to go. Hijacking planes, sinking refugee boats, bombing American cities, even faking civilian deaths, all to provoke public outrage and justify invading Cuba. One memo, written in a tone so cold it's almost surreal, proposed developing a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area. Another detailed how they could simulate a Cuban attack on a passenger airliner, possibly filled with college students, to spark nationwide fury. They literally discussed planting fake evidence, staging funerals, and creating fabricated casualty lists to manipulate the media. Here's where it gets even darker. Every single member of the Joint Chiefs signed off on it. The plan made it all the way to President John F. Kennedy's desk. His reaction, absolute horror. He rejected it instantly and soon began efforts to replace the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the plan's main architect. Operation Northwoods was buried for 35 years. It wasn't until 1997 that a researcher uncovered the documents through the Freedom of Information Act. And when the public finally saw the files, the reaction was disbelief followed by silence. What these documents revealed was a truth most people still struggle to accept: that deception, manipulation, and psychological warfare aren't reserved for enemies abroad. They've also been drafted for use at home. Scholars from Harvard and Georgetown later cited Operation Northwoods as a case study in moral drift, how institutions built to defend freedom can justify almost anything in the name of national security. It's the kind of story that makes you question how many other accidents in history might have had blueprints behind them. And if you think this was the only time Americans were betrayed by their own institutions, just wait until we talk about how one of the richest, most successful black communities in America was wiped off the map and erased from history books for nearly a century. The Black Wall Street Massacre, 1921. Picture this, a thriving, self-made community filled with doctors, business owners, and entrepreneurs. A place so successful, it was nicknamed Black Wall Street. Now imagine it erased in less than 24 hours. In May 1921, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, was one of the most prosperous black communities in the United States. It had its own banks, hotels, theaters, and even private airplanes, a rare sight in any city at the time. But that success was exactly what made it a target. When a false accusation against a young black man spread through town, white mobs, some deputized by local officials, unleashed a coordinated assault that historians now recognize as one of the worst acts of racial violence in American history. For decades, it was labeled a riot. But the truth, it was an organized military attack. Eyewitnesses described private planes dropping firebombs, one of the first aerial assaults on civilians in the US, while mobs set fire to homes and businesses block by block. Machine guns were mounted on trucks. Entire families were gunned down trying to flee. By the next morning, 35 square blocks had been reduced to ash. The death toll officially around 36. But modern investigations suggest it could be closer to 300, with thousands more injured and over 10,000 left homeless. The aftermath was just as horrifying. Survivors were arrested, insurance claims denied, and new city ordinances made rebuilding nearly impossible. And then the silence began. Newspapers were ordered to remove articles. Police archives were purged. Pages were literally cut from bound history books. For nearly 80 years, this atrocity was erased from education news and public records. It wasn't until 1996 that Oklahoma finally opened an investigation. Using ground-penetrating radar, researchers discovered evidence of mass graves. But by then, most survivors had passed away, their stories buried with them. Here's the haunting part. This wasn't just about racism. It was about erasing economic empowerment. Greenwood proved that a black community could thrive independently, and that terrified the status quo. Sociologists today call it economic erasure, the deliberate destruction of generational wealth and cultural memory. It took until 2009 for Oklahoma schools to even mention the massacre, and until 2019, when an HBO series brought it to public awareness for most Americans to learn it ever happened. If history can be erased that completely, it makes you wonder, what else have we lost to silence? Because the next secret wasn't just buried. It was locked away by one of the most powerful agencies in the world, one that literally tried to rewrite the human mind. CIA mind control experiments, 1953 to 1973. If a spy movie opened with a government secretly drugging citizens to erase their memories, you'd probably roll your eyes too far-fetched, right? Except this one actually happened, and it was funded by the CIA. Between the 1950s and 1970s, under a program called MKUltra, the CIA conducted hundreds of experiments on unwitting Americans. Their goal: to control the human mind, to create programmable assassins, erase memories, and manipulate behavior. How? By dosing people with LSD, torturing them with electroshock therapy, and using sensory deprivation, all without consent. Hospitals, prisons, and universities were recruited through front organizations. Patients thought they were receiving therapy or research treatment. In reality, they were test subjects in one of the most unethical experiments in modern history. One infamous doctor in Canada forced patients to listen to repetitive recorded messages 16 hours a day, while heavily drugged, before wiping their memories with shock treatments at 40 times normal intensity. These people forgot their families, their jobs, even their own names. When MKUltra was exposed in 1975 during congressional hearings, the CIA director claimed the program had ended. Conveniently, most of the records had already been destroyed by his order. The few that survived did so only because they were misfiled in a box of financial documents. But here's where it gets even darker. Declassified files from the 1980s and 1990s show that similar sub-projects continued under new names, with tighter secrecy and better cover stories. One particularly disturbing operation involved CIA-run brothels in San Francisco and New York. where clients were unknowingly dosed with LSD, while agents filmed their reactions behind one-way mirrors. And according to a 2010 presidential bioethics report, non-consensual human experiments continued well into the 21st century, involving soldiers exposed to nerve gas radiation and experimental drugs without their knowledge. The report concluded that ethical oversight mechanisms remain vulnerable when national security interests are invoked. Translation: the same excuse still works. Today, MKUltra is often dismissed as conspiracy history, but it's fully documented in the CIA's own declassified archives. Even Harvard and MIT researchers now study it as a warning, a case study in how science without ethics can become weaponized. It's a reminder that knowledge is power, and sometimes power wants to know how to erase knowledge itself. And if you think that was the lowest point of moral decay, wait until you hear how the government turned its own justice agency into a weapon not against enemies abroad, but against its own citizens. The FBI's War on Activists, 1956 to 1971. Imagine living in a country where your phone is tapped, your mail is opened, and strangers try to turn your friends against you all because you dared to speak out. That was America during the FBI's secret domestic intelligence operation known as COINTELPRO. From 1956 to 1971, the FBI ran a covert campaign designed to disrupt, discredit, and neutralize citizens the Bureau deemed subversive. The targets: civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, journalists, women's rights groups, Native American organizers, anyone who questioned the government. Agents didn't just spy. They infiltrated movements, spread false rumors, and even pushed people toward violence to justify arrests. They mailed anonymous letters designed to destroy reputations, break marriages, and drive activists to suicide. One such letter was sent to a civil rights leader just before he received the Nobel Peace Prize. It ended with the line, "There is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is." For years, COINTELPRO's existence was a rumor, until a group of anti-war activists broke into an FBI office in 1971 and stole classified documents. What they found stunned the world: over 2,000 operations targeting ordinary citizens under the pretext of national security. The documents revealed how far the Bureau would go. Against the Black Panther Party, the FBI created fake letters claiming certain members were informants, triggering deadly shootouts between friends. In one infamous case, agents provided Chicago police with a detailed floor plan of a Panther leader's apartment and drugged his drink before a pre-dawn raid that killed him as he slept. And when Congress investigated the FBI director at the time, J. Edgar Hoover admitted to excesses, but claimed they were necessary to protect democracy. No one was charged. No one lost their job. But here's what's rarely discussed: the tactics never really ended. Declassified memos from the 1980s and beyond show identical strategies being used under new program names. After 9/11, the FBI publicly acknowledged infiltrating environmental and anti-war groups, labeling peaceful protesters as domestic threats. According to a 2011 Department of Justice report, the Bureau still employs behavioral disruption techniques derived from COINTELPRO playbooks, only now they're wrapped in layers of legality and surveillance tech. The names change. The mission doesn't. Sociologists call it institutional muscle memory. Once a system learns how to silence dissent, it doesn't forget, it just modernizes. And speaking of moral collapse hidden under the banner of science, our next story takes you deep into an experiment so monstrous it reads like a horror novel, except every word is documented fact. Human disease experiments in Guatemala, 1946 to 1948. Just months after the world condemned Nazi doctors for their crimes in the Nuremberg trials, American scientists quietly began experiments that would make your skin crawl. In Guatemala between 1946 and 1948, US government researchers deliberately infected nearly 1,500 people with syphilis and gonorrhea without their consent and often without treatment. The test subjects weren't volunteers. They were prisoners, soldiers, sex workers, and patients in psychiatric hospitals. People the researchers believed wouldn't be missed or believed. When natural infection rates proved too slow, the scientists went further. They used syringes to inject bacteria directly into their subjects' bodies, sometimes into open wounds. In one report, a doctor noted that patients developed severe lesions, but instead of helping them, the team observed progression because that was the experiment. The logic was cold and methodical. Understand how venereal diseases spread so future soldiers could be protected. The lead researcher, John Cutler, had previously worked on the infamous Tuskegee study, where black men with syphilis were left untreated for decades. When that study started facing scrutiny, Cutler simply took his work abroad where ethical oversight didn't exist. The Guatemalan government wasn't informed. Records were classified. Even academic papers based on the data made no mention of deliberate infection. For over 60 years, the US successfully buried the entire operation. Then in 2005, a historian researching Tuskegee stumbled across old boxes of documents, complete with photos, charts, and handwritten notes describing the Guatemala experiments. 5 years later, in 2010, the truth finally went public. President Obama formally apologized to Guatemala, calling it a tragic chapter in our history. But there was no accountability, no prosecutions, no compensation. In 2015, Guatemala's survivors filed a lawsuit in US court, and it was dismissed under sovereign immunity. Translation: the government can't be sued for crimes it commits overseas. Harvard bioethicist Susan Reverby later described it as a perfect moral mirror, the US condemning human experimentation in Germany while doing the same thing in secret. And here's the chilling part: the legal mechanisms that protected those researchers, secrecy, classification, and immunity, still exist today. They were never dismantled. They were refined. If this sounds like a nightmare from another century, brace yourself. Because the next chapter isn't about some distant foreign field experiment. It's about what was happening inside America's own hospitals, prisons, and schools, where radiation itself became a weapon of research. Secret radiation tests, 1944 to 1974. While Americans were being told that nuclear energy would light the future, the US government was secretly using it to experiment on its own citizens. From 1944 to 1974, over 4,000 radiation experiments were conducted without consent on pregnant women, hospital patients, prisoners, and even children. It started during the Manhattan Project when scientists racing to build the atomic bomb wanted to understand how radiation moved through the body. But instead of running animal studies, they used people. In one experiment, terminally ill patients were injected with plutonium without being told what it was. Doctors said it was a new treatment. It wasn't. It was data collection. At a Massachusetts state school, mentally disabled boys were given oatmeal mixed with radioactive isotopes, told it was part of a science club. At Vanderbilt University, 829 pregnant women were given vitamin drinks secretly containing radioactive iron. Decades later, follow-up studies showed increased cancer rates in both the mothers and their children. And in Oregon and Washington prisons, inmates were paid a few dollars to let researchers irradiate their testicles to study fertility damage. Many developed cancers in the following years. None were told the real risks. These experiments weren't rogue operations, they were approved by high-level officials. Funding came directly from the Atomic Energy Commission and the Department of Defense. A 1947 memo warned against telling the public, saying disclosure would cause a reaction adverse to the national interest. In other words, the cover-up was policy. For decades, scientific journals quietly published results from these studies, carefully omitting any mention of human subjects or consent. It wasn't until the 1990s, 50 years later, that a massive declassification effort finally revealed the truth. In 1993, the US Secretary of Energy ordered an investigation, and in 1995, a Presidential Advisory Committee confirmed the full scope: thousands of citizens deliberately exposed to radiation without knowledge or permission. Their conclusion was devastating. Ethical standards were subordinated to military and political objectives. In plain English, human rights were expendable when secrecy demanded it. Some victims received modest settlements, but many never even learned they were test subjects. The institutions involved, universities, labs, hospitals, faced no real consequences. And perhaps the most bitter irony, at the same time these experiments were happening, the US was prosecuting Nazi doctors in Nuremberg for the very same crimes. It's a reminder that the line between defense and deceit often disappears when science serves the state. And speaking of vanished lines, our next story takes us to a war that was nearly erased from American history altogether, one where an entire nation was told it never happened. The Philippine War Atrocities, 1899 to 1902. Here's a question. How can a war that killed nearly 1 million people simply vanish from history books? The answer lies in the Philippine-American War, a brutal 3-year conflict that most Americans have never heard of because it was deliberately rewritten as a benevolent liberation. After defeating Spain in 1898, the United States took control of the Philippines. But instead of granting independence as promised, Washington decided to keep the islands as a colony. The result was a bloody insurgency where US forces fought Filipino revolutionaries who had once been their allies. The tactics were horrifying. Entire villages were burned. Civilians were rounded up into concentration camps euphemistically called reconcentration zones. One US General, Jacob H. Smith, famously ordered his men to kill everyone over the age of 10 on the island of Samar, saying, "The more you kill and burn, the better it will please me." He was court-martialed later, but only retired with full pension. Soldiers documented what they saw in letters home, accounts of torture executions and the use of the water cure, a forerunner of modern waterboarding. Prisoners were forced to swallow gallons of water until they passed out or died, all to extract confessions. The death toll was staggering. Historians estimate between 200,000 and 1 million Filipino civilians died mostly from disease and starvation in the camps. And yet American textbooks for most of the 20th century described the war as a peaceful occupation. When journalists tried to report the truth, they were branded unpatriotic. Newspapers critical of the war faced government pressure and censorship. Congress held hearings, but the results were quietly buried, and officers involved were either acquitted or promoted. Modern researchers at Stanford and the University of the Philippines have since reconstructed the real story from military records, systematic massacres, cover-ups, and propaganda campaigns that turned a colonial conquest into a moral crusade. It's a classic example of what historians now call Imperial amnesia, when a superpower rewrites its own atrocities to preserve the illusion of righteousness. Even more disturbing, the tactics developed during the Philippine campaign reconcentration camps, psychological warfare, and pacification zones became the blueprint for US military strategies in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan a century later. The Philippines still teaches this war as a defining struggle for independence. In America, it's barely a footnote, because it's easier to remember victories than to admit the cost of empire. And yet even this wasn't the cruelest act buried in 20th century archives. Because in the next story, the government didn't just suppress revolutions or experiments, it went after something far more innocent: children's breakfast. Sabotaging free breakfast programs, 1969 to 1975. Of all the scandals in this story, this one might sting the most because it wasn't about secret weapons or foreign wars. It was about hungry kids getting breakfast. In 1969, a revolutionary community group, the Black Panther Party, launched a simple, legal, and wildly effective idea-free breakfast for children. Every morning, volunteers cooked hot meals for tens of thousands of kids across 45 US cities. No forms, no bureaucracy, no cost. Teachers reported better attention, fewer behavioral problems, and improved grades. For many kids, it was the only meal they'd eat all day. Public health experts praised it. Even local churches donated space. So naturally, the FBI declared it a national security threat. According to declassified memos, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover called the Breakfast for Children program the greatest threat to internal security of the United States. Why? Because it worked. Because it showed that marginalized communities could take care of their own effectively and compassionately without government permission. So the FBI went to war against breakfast. Agents spread false rumors that the food was poisoned. They sent letters to pastors hosting breakfast sites, warning them the Panthers were violent extremists. Some churches withdrew support out of fear. In Chicago, police raided a breakfast service mid-meal, destroying food and terrifying children. In Baltimore, there are documented reports of agents or their affiliates actually poisoning food supplies. Food suppliers were pressured to stop donating. Parents who let their kids attend were harassed or questioned by police. And when churches and volunteers resisted raids, became more violent, timed deliberately for early morning when children were eating. Internal FBI reports bragged about successful disruption, noting declines in the number of children fed. Think about that: a government agency measured success by how many hungry children went unfed. Eventually, under relentless sabotage, the program collapsed, but its impact lived on. The Federal School Breakfast Program, established in 1975, was modeled directly after the Panthers Initiative. The difference? That one came with government approval. Historians at Stanford and Howard University now describe the Panthers program as one of the most influential social movements of the 20th century, one that forced America to recognize food as a human right. And yet the official story still glosses over this. The government never admitted wrongdoing. No agents were prosecuted. The documents remain footnotes in archives quietly labeled counterintelligence operations. But when you look at the bigger picture, all these stories, the coup attempts, secret experiments, erased massacres, share one pattern: whenever people challenge power or reveal truth, the system fights back with silence. And the silence works until someone digs deep enough to break it. Because, as history shows, truth has a strange way of leaking through the cracks. So what do all these buried stories have in common, from Wall Street's near coup to the CIA's mind experiments, from erased massacres to sabotaged breakfasts? They all reveal the same uncomfortable truth: power hides its own history. Each event was real, documented, and later verified, yet each was almost completely erased. Not by time, but by design. In every case, officials claimed it was for national security or public safety or the greater good. But look closely, and you see a pattern that runs deeper than politics, a kind of institutional instinct to protect itself no matter the cost. The business plot showed that even democracy's defenders can become its enemies when money's at stake. Operation Northwoods revealed that freedom can be twisted into theater when war needs justification. The Tulsa massacre proved that prosperity can be destroyed when it threatens privilege. MK Ultra taught us that science without ethics becomes cruelty disguised as curiosity. And COINTELPRO, perhaps the darkest of them all, showed how easily the state can turn on its own citizens the moment they question authority. These aren't isolated scandals, they're a map of how truth disappears. Textbooks skip them. Films romanticize them. Official archives redact them. But every time one of these stories resurfaces through a forgotten memo, a survivor's testimony, or a misfiled box of evidence, it reminds us that the past is not fixed. It's edited. Maybe the beauty of history isn't in its certainty, but in its rediscovery. Because the moment we stop questioning history, stops evolving and becomes mythology. So here's the real takeaway. The next time you read a headline, a textbook, or a government statement, remember these 10 stories. Remember how often the unbelievable turned out to be true. And ask yourself, what else haven't we been told yet? If you love exploring how history, science, and secrecy collide, and how truth always finds a way to resurface, make sure you subscribe. Because every week we'll keep digging into the mysteries that remind us reality is stranger, darker, and far more fascinating than fiction.